3 days after my father died, my husband came home, placed his office keys on the kitchen counter, and calmly announced that he had quit his job. I was still wearing the black dress I had worn to my father's funeral. There were flowers dying in the hallway, sympathy cards scattered across the dining table, and my father's photograph standing beside a candle that had burned almost to the bottom. I could barely breathe through the grief, yet my husband looked strangely relieved. He had already started planning a future I had never agreed to give him. At first, I thought he had lost his mind from the stress of everything that had happened. Then he said something that made the room feel colder than winter. He told me there was no reason for him to keep working because, sooner or later, my father's inheritance would become our money. In that instant, I realized that while I had been mourning the man who raised me, my husband had been counting what he thought he was about to receive. If you believe that love should never be measured by money, and that kindness and second chances can change a person's life, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps these emotional stories reach people who may need a little hope today. My name is Claire, and before my father died, I had never thought of myself as wealthy. My father had built his small manufacturing company from nothing. He had started with a rented workshop, an old machine, and a stubborn belief that honest work could change a family's future. By the time I was an adult, the company had grown, but my father never became the kind of man who displayed his wealth. He drove the same modest car for years, wore inexpensive watches, and still complained when someone charged him too much for coffee. What mattered most to him was family. He had raised me after my mother passed away when I was young, and he had spent years teaching me that money was a tool, not a measure of worth. Whenever I asked him what would happen to his company someday, he would smile and tell me that whatever he left behind would come with responsibility attached to it. I understood that lesson only after he was gone. My husband, Daniel, had always known my father was comfortable, but I never realized how closely he had been watching. When Daniel and I married, my father welcomed him. He never treated Daniel as an outsider. He helped us with the down payment on our small house and even offered Daniel a position in the company when Daniel complained that his own job was going nowhere. Daniel refused because he wanted to build his own career. For the first few years of our marriage, I believed we were happy. We weren't perfect, but I thought we were partners. We had ordinary arguments about groceries, bills, vacations, and whose turn it was to clean the kitchen. We dreamed about traveling someday. We talked about having children. We had photographs on the refrigerator and inside jokes that made me smile even during difficult days. Then my father became sick. His illness progressed quickly, and the strong man I had always known became fragile. I spent nights beside his hospital bed, holding his hand while machines hummed around us. Daniel visited, but his visits became shorter. At first, I assumed he was exhausted from work. Later, I noticed that he often asked questions that seemed strangely unrelated to my father's health. He wanted to know whether my father had changed his will. He asked whether the company would be sold. He asked whether there were properties involved. I told him I didn't know and didn't care. My only concern was having more time with my father. 3 days before my father died, he asked me to come close to his bed. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. He told me that he had arranged everything legally and that I should never allow anyone to make me feel guilty for protecting what he had built. At the time, I didn't understand why he said that. I simply kissed his forehead and promised him I would be okay. He died the next morning. The funeral passed like a dream. People hugged me, prayed for me, and told me my father was finally at peace. I heard every word, but none of it seemed real. The house felt unbearably quiet without his phone ringing or his footsteps coming through the front door. 3 days later, Daniel quit his job. He said we didn't need his salary anymore. I stared at him, unable to understand. He began talking about the inheritance as if it were already sitting in our bank account. He talked about paying off the mortgage, buying a larger house, replacing his car, investing in restaurants, and taking a long vacation. He had even created a list on his phone. I asked him when he had become so interested in my father's money. His answer broke something inside me. He said that after marriage, there was no such thing as his money or my money. Everything belonged to the family. But when I asked whether he had discussed quitting his job with me before doing it, he had no answer. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked into my father's old study, which still smelled faintly of cedar and the cologne he used. I opened the desk drawer and found an envelope with my name written on it in his handwriting. Inside was a letter. My father had anticipated everything. He had placed the majority of his assets into a protected inheritance structure in my name alone. The house we lived in, he explained, was separate from that inheritance. The company's shares, investment accounts, and properties he left me were not marital assets simply because I was married. Then came the sentence that made my hands tremble. He wrote that he had worried someone might love the future he could provide me more than they loved me. I sat on the floor and cried. Not because I had inherited money. Because my father had understood something I hadn't. Over the following weeks, Daniel became increasingly impatient. He complained that I was taking too long to access the money. He demanded information about the accounts. When I refused to give him passwords or financial documents, his personality changed. The man who once brought me tea when I was sick began calling me selfish. The man who once promised to stand beside me through every hardship began telling me that I owed him a better life. Then he made the mistake that changed everything. He told me that if I loved him, I would put the inheritance into a joint account. I finally understood that he wasn't grieving with me. He was waiting for my grief to end so he could begin spending what he believed belonged to him. I packed a small suitcase and left the house. I went to stay with my father's longtime assistant, Margaret, an older woman who had worked with my father for more than 20 years. She didn't ask me for money. She didn't ask what I planned to do with the inheritance. She simply opened her door and told me I could stay as long as I needed. For the first time since my father's death, I felt safe. But the hardest part was still ahead. Daniel filed for divorce. I expected him to fight for the marriage. Instead, he fought over the money. His attorney argued that he had given up his career because he believed our financial future was secure. They claimed that my inheritance had influenced his decision to quit. The irony was almost unbearable. He had voluntarily abandoned his job, and now he wanted me to compensate him for it. I was terrified. There were nights when I wondered whether my father had been wrong to leave everything to me. Maybe money really did destroy relationships. Maybe I should simply give Daniel what he wanted and walk away. Then Margaret found me sitting alone at the kitchen table one evening. She placed my father's old letter in front of me. She reminded me of what he had written. Protect what I built, not because money matters, but because your choices matter. Those words changed me. I stopped apologizing for having boundaries. I hired a lawyer. I gathered every document. I kept every message Daniel had sent me about the inheritance. And slowly, the truth became impossible to ignore. Daniel had quit his job 3 days after my father died because he believed my inheritance would support him indefinitely. He had already researched luxury apartments. He had contacted a car dealership. He had even spoken with an investment broker about using part of my inheritance to start a business in his name. The court proceedings were painful, but they also gave me clarity. Daniel wasn't entitled to control the inheritance simply because he was my husband. His decision to quit his job had been his own. When the divorce was finally settled, I walked out of the courthouse carrying a folder of documents and feeling strangely empty. I had won financially, but I had lost a marriage. For several months afterward, I struggled with guilt. I wondered whether I had somehow failed. I wondered whether I should have noticed the warning signs earlier. Then something unexpected happened. I discovered that my father had left me one final instruction. He wanted me to use part of the inheritance to establish a scholarship for children whose parents could not afford education. I went to the first scholarship ceremony months later. There were 12 children sitting in a small school auditorium. Their clothes were simple. Their parents looked nervous and overwhelmed. When the first child received her scholarship letter, she began crying. Her mother hugged her. And I suddenly remembered my father telling me that money was only valuable when it could become something bigger than itself. That day, I understood what he had really left me. Not wealth. A responsibility. Over the next 2 years, the scholarship program grew. We helped dozens of students continue their education. I invested responsibly, kept my father's company stable, and eventually returned to work alongside the people who had helped him build it. I also learned something about love. Real love doesn't demand access to your bank account. Real love doesn't make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. Real love doesn't disappear when money is removed from the equation. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that losing someone doesn't mean losing everything they gave you. My father was gone, but his lessons were still shaping my life. One afternoon, I returned to his old study. The same desk was there. The same wooden shelf stood against the wall. I opened the drawer and touched the edge of the letter he had left me. I finally smiled. Because I understood. He hadn't been trying to protect his money from my husband. He had been trying to protect his daughter from believing that being loved came with a price. Daniel eventually rebuilt his life. I heard through mutual friends that he had found another job and started over. I didn't hate him anymore. That took time, but eventually I realized forgiveness wasn't about letting him back into my life. It was about refusing to let what he had done poison the rest of mine. Years later, when people asked me what I inherited from my father, I could have mentioned the company's shares, the properties, or the investments. Instead, I always gave the same answer. I inherited the courage to know my worth. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who may be struggling to recognize their own worth, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks for more stories about love, loss, courage, and second chances. And before we end, I have one special request for you. Comment. My worth is not for sale. If you believe that true love should never depend on money. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't something you can put in a bank. Sometimes it is a lesson left behind by someone who loved you enough to prepare you for the day they would no longer be there. And sometimes, the hardest goodbye becomes the beginning of the life you were always meant to live.